The series I am starting today, chronicling the nearly 2 decades-long secret war in Laos, has affected me deeply. So, I would like to take a moment to dedicate this project firstly to the people of Laos, and additionally to the Vietnamese, Lao, Thai, Cambodian, Myanmar, and American victims of the wars in Southeast Asia. I hope that the several months of work that I have put into this series will serve to shine a light onto some of the more overlooked aspects of these often discussed wars, and will help to understand the nature of Western foreign policy. As always, I make these videos for purely educational and entertainment purposes, and do not endorse nor celebrate any of the events depicted. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. In 1961, as John F. Kennedy prepared for his inauguration as the 35th President of the United States, he received some key advice from the outgoing two-term President Dwight D. Eisenhower. According to Kennedy chronicler and historian Arthur Schlesinger, the elder statesman and five-star general told the young president-elect that it was not Vietnam that worried him in Southeast Asia, but instead the relatively uninhabited and economically insignificant country of Laos that was of his primary concern. Laos, a country that Eisenhower had supported with millions of dollars in aid and military equipment, was, as he put it, quote, the key to Southeast Asia. And as he saw it, the country was quickly slipping into civil war. The young Kennedy remained unconvinced. He apparently pronounced Laos as Laos.
A large group of powers agreed to a settlement of the struggle for Indochina. Laos was one of the new states,
due to his belief that Americans would not support a campaign in a country that had the same English pronunciation as louse, the small wingless parasitic insects. Nevertheless, Eisenhower would be proven at least half correct. Throughout the 1960s, Laos would progress from moderate instability to a fully fledged war-torn battlefield, filled with a multitude of guerrilla armies fighting for control. Eisenhower may have been mistaken on his tepid prediction for Vietnam, but he clearly understood the importance Laos would play in a potential conflict in the region. It is unclear, however, if Eisenhower, or anyone for that matter in 1960, could have predicted the sheer brutality of the campaign undertaken by the Pentagon and the CIA in Laos. Laos was dealt the most merciless fate of arguably any country during the Cold War. The bombing campaign, that started under President Johnson and massively expanded under Nixon, remains essentially unfathomable. The tiny country, roughly the size of Great Britain, remains to this day the most bombed country by square kilometer in history. More than Vietnam, more than Iraq, and more than Afghanistan. According to The Guardian, between 1964 and 1973, Laos was subjected to, on average, 1 plane load of bombs every 8 minutes. In retrospect, the policy in Laos, especially in the early 70s, was total, unrelenting incineration. And the people there still live with the consequences of this devastating, nearly decade-long campaign. In 2021, there were 63 accidents related to unexploded ordnances, and it is expected to take up to 100 years to clear all the unexploded bombs from Laos. And yet these days, it feels like we never talk about Laos, and the nearly 2 decades-long conflict that took place there. Why? There are a few reasons why I believe we almost never hear about Laos. Primarily, and maybe most simply, Americans were not the ones primarily fighting and dying in Laos. Sure, American pilots and CIA officers perished in the war there, but most of the bloodshed was wrought on locals. But beyond that fact, a major reason as to why we don't hear about Laos is because any serious research into either French or US activities in the country inevitably leads to the darkest and dirtiest dimensions of modern foreign policy. Laos was in fact the first country where the CIA would be tasked with undertaking a full-on secret war. From 1964 to 1971, the CIA was primarily in charge of the US campaign in Laos. And there, they would develop and perfect policies that would replicate themselves in other paramilitary and guerrilla warfare campaigns across the globe. Laos was the test run for decades of secret narco-fueled guerrilla war bands, all done covertly and without official congressional approval. The parallels between the CIA campaign in Laos, and specifically the CIA campaign in Afghanistan, I find to be particularly interesting, and I encourage you to keep this at the back of your mind throughout this series. But even before the CIA got involved, and even before Laos was independent, the French colonial administration of Indochina set up some of the first narco-counterinsurgency programs ever. These novel narco-fueled armies would subsequently be repurposed by the CIA in their own campaign in the region, to much more effective and devastating effect. So today, let's enter Southeast Asia's heart of darkness, where wars had no rules, where opium could buy armies, and where the CIA became an agency of war. As always, I cite all my sources in the description to every video. Every chapter of this video will have a number at the top of the screen like so. Below the video, you can find a matching bibliographic citation to the source I pulled this information from. Now, this is usually where I highlight a few key sources that I used throughout the episode, and I highlight some of my favorite books I pulled, etc. But I will instead reserve this for one bonus video at the end of the series, where I'll be highlighting not only the sources from this series, but my entire CIA series up to this point. Viewers have been asking for a book list for a while, and it will come at the end of this series. If you are still curious right now before that video comes out, all my sources are as usual in the description below. Now, very quickly before we proceed, I want to settle one last small administrative detail before we move on, and that is this whole pronunciation question regarding the word Laos. Now, according to my research, I have found that there are two acceptable pronunciations of this country's name. The typical English pronunciation is Laos, with a pronounced S. The pronunciation in the Lao language, however, does not pronounce the S, so it is pronounced Lao. For the purposes of this project, I'll be pronouncing this country as Laos, with a defined S. This is for two reasons. Firstly, I am speaking English, and generally, this pronunciation is considered correct in English. And in my personal opinion, I do find that this pronunciation sounds more natural in an English context. And this is because of the second reason, and maybe the more important reason, is because I will not be using the outdated and incorrect Lao demonym of Laotian. Instead, I will be using the demonym of Lao. And to not confuse the demonym and the country name, I will stick with the pronunciation of this country as Laos. So, just to recap, it will be the country of Laos, and let's say we're talking about Lao food, I will be using the word Lao and not Laotian. Okay, I hope that cleared everything up, and I hope that makes sense. Without further ado, let's get into Laos.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
I want to begin today by emphasizing the fact that Laos is a truly remote country. Throughout most of its history, the area comprising Laos has been nearly ungovernable by both the colonial powers that held the territory before 1954 and afterwards during the nearly 2 decades of constant civil war and regime change that befell the newly independent country. Laos is simply put an aberration. Although the country's name refers to the Lao people, who made up the majority of the country's meager 3 million people in the early 1970s, throughout its history, the state was teeming with different ethnicities and cultural groups that mostly lived in the wild frontiers of the country in the surrounding border regions. With little infrastructure and difficult jungle and mountainous terrain, many of these rural people lived their lives in semi-autonomous tribal groupings, distinct from the French colonial and later Royal Lao administrations in the capital of Vientiane. Effective taxation always proved challenging, and centralized rule of the periphery remained an impossibility for most of the ruling governments. Also to note is the lack of any rigid border security in the rugged boundaries of the country. I mentioned in my previous video on Burma that overall, Southeast Asian borders were difficult to manage and to properly regulate due to the harsh terrain and intermingling of common ethnic groups across the newly fabricated international borders. This was especially the case in Laos, where international borders were only real on maps. On the ground, the hill people had little regard for the Western concept of the Westphalian nation-state. To put this into perspective, in 1970, roughly 8 million Lao people lived in northeastern Thailand, at a time where only 1.5 million Lao ethnic people lived in Laos in total. Now, surely some of these people were probably recent refugees from the ongoing conflict in Laos, but Alfred Mccoy makes the point clearly that Lao people were scattered across the Golden Triangle. He calls the idea of Lao nationhood a fiction perpetuated by the colonial powers and later the Cold War negotiators. This statement by Mccoy may sound arrogant or condescending towards the fledgling country, but his point is more nuanced. The people of Laos's rugged borderlands were themselves left largely undisturbed by French colonial authorities, simply for the fact that administering these provinces properly often proved more trouble than it was worth. Laos held little geopolitical importance besides acting as a buffer zone between the neighboring British colonies in Burma, and it contained few natural resources of great value. Well, except for opium, of course, and that it had in abundance. The Golden Triangle, as I discussed at length in the last video, and as seen on screen now, is a rough geographic region that encompasses the three northern Southeast Asian states of Burma, Laos, and Vietnam, as well as the southern Chinese province of Yunnan. The Golden Triangle was the main global producer of opium during most of the Cold War. Now, for purposes of our video today, it is no coincidence that Laos is perfectly situated at the dead center of the triangle. The highlands of northern Laos presented the perfect alkaline soil and altitude to sustain abundant poppy fields, and the denizens of this region had for generations engaged in the opium harvest as a source of funding, growing harvests of rice for sustenance and poppies for profit. For the highland farmers, opium was not seen as a horribly addictive narcotic, but instead a simple economic reality. The vast majority of farmers in northern Laos were far from wealthy drug barons and were instead simply sustenance farmers trying to support their families and communities by any means available. Because it's important to understand, Laos really had few alternative strategic resources to offer. Other than relatively insignificant tin deposits and tropical wood, the rugged and inhospitable jungles of Laos are barren of most other valuable commodities. Life in the highlands remains difficult and unforgiving to this day. Now, if we return to the Golden Triangle map for a second, you will notice that Laos is also critical for another key reason. Laos was in essence the gateway through Southeast Asia, especially as far as the contraband trade goes. The country provided key caravan routes from the opium fields in the north to the two major narcotic ports of the subcontinent, those being Bangkok in Thailand, which as we covered last time would be the main export center for the Shan state of Burma, another wild frontier booming with opium, and also the major South Vietnamese port city of Saigon, seat of the French colonial government and later the capital city of the US-backed Republic of South Vietnam. Laos's lack of cohesive central authority, its official yet arguable neutral status in the Vietnam War, and its centrality in Southeast Asia would lead to constant struggles amongst its neighbors for control of the peripheries and the trade routes running through it. Of course, Laos may be known to most of you as the main artery of North Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran along the spine of its southeastern border. National Liberation Front of South Vietnam guerrillas, known colloquially at the time as the Viet Cong, would rearm and regroup with the help of North Vietnamese caravans running through the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. This critical supply line, critical to the North Vietnamese war effort, would continue to confound American policymakers, leading to the devastating bombing campaign in Laos as described earlier. We're getting ahead of ourselves now though. All this to say that Laos was the gateway of Southeast Asia, and all powers involved in either the narcotics trade and or the many wars that took place in the subcontinent fought tirelessly for control of its borders. Our story begins in 1893 with the formal addition of Laos into the French colony in Indochina. The French established themselves in the city of Vientiane in the west of the country. Unlike the bustling city of Saigon in South Vietnam, Vientiane resembled a quiet mountain village comprised of small tin-roofed huts and dirt roads. The French quickly realized that their new colonial possession would not provide the same fruits as their other holdings in the region, but they would soon discover that Laos held hidden riches, and would shortly begin exploiting the one resource that Laos had in abundance: opium. During this period, the colonial powers in the Far East, France, the Netherlands, and Great Britain, all held substantial opium monopolies, vested in their overseas holdings. Opium provided massive net profit to the overseas colonial administrations, both through the monopolistic status afforded to them and through the heavy taxation involved in the trade, under the head tax system. Essentially, every farmer paid a yearly tax to the colonial government to be allowed to harvest poppies under legal sanction. It was an effective model, and the French quickly integrated Laos into the Indo-Chinese Opium Board. In the north of Laos, where the poppy thrived, the French encountered their newest clients in the opium business: the Hmong people. The Hmong were relatively new to Laos, having been expelled from their homelands in southern China in the first half of the 19th century. For centuries, the Hmong lived harmoniously in the southern Chinese provinces, growing their traditional cash crop, the opium poppy. The Chinese Empire had long practiced a tributary system, allowing minor kingdoms within the empire to persist if they paid a hefty allowance to the central government. In 1644, this policy was abruptly ended by the incoming Manchu dynasty in China, which began the policy of integrating the vagabond Hmong petty kingdoms directly into the burgeoning imperial bureaucracy. For nearly 2 centuries, the Manchu Empire undertook violent and brutal policies attempting to usurp the Hmong kings and to control their lucrative crop. Throughout this period, droves of Hmong refugees fled into neighboring Laos, where they could continue to act independently within the uncharted frontier. By the early 1900s, the Hmong had essentially all emigrated to Laos, where they re-established themselves as small, independent opium tribes. Their primary customers would no longer be the Chinese Empire, but instead a new empire, the French. For the 40 years of relative international peace between the colonization of Laos in 1893 and the onset of World War II, the opium trade in Laos proceeded largely unimpeded, with gradual but moderate increases in production and continued cooperation between the French authority and the Hmong. Alfred Mccoy notes that in the 1920s, for example, Laos produced only a mere 60 tons of raw opium yearly, comparatively to the gargantuan 6,380 tons produced in China. Laos was an insignificant player in this market, but still brought a significant profit to the French colony. All this would change when the Nazis invaded France in 1941, and Laos would fall under Vichy and Japanese control. Vietnamese and Lao nationalism would no longer be a far-flung dream. War was coming to the subcontinent, and opium would boom. In the 1940s, France was invaded by the Nazis, as everybody knows, and split into 2 distinct administrations. The south of France was given the semblance of autonomy under the French Vichy regime, under Marshal Philippe Pétain. One of the provisions afforded to the Vichy regime by the Germans was control over their former colonies, including French Indochina. Although the French technically still controlled Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos on paper, the reality on the ground in Vietnam was quite different, however. The Vichy regime allowed their Axis partners in the East, the Imperial Japanese, to station their troops in Vietnam, to use it as a launching pad for further excursions into Burma and eventually eastern India. Although the French still retained de jure control of their colony, the Japanese could take control at any moment's notice. The 2 powers coexisted as rulers of Indochina for most of the war, the French continuing the administration of the colony while the Japanese dominated militarily. Vietnamese peasants and laborers who had lived under the yoke of French colonialism for almost a century saw this change in administration as a clear sign that French control of their territory was diminished. Nationalism began to course throughout the population, and independence seemed achievable. However, in early 1945, the situation in Indochina changed drastically for the French, as the Japanese took formal control of Vietnam with the fall of Vichy France to the Allied forces in Europe. For the Japanese, this was too little too late, as the Americans were making steady headway in the Pacific, and British troops were firmly in control of India. As Allied troops took control of Burma by mid-1945, the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA, sent one of the first American intelligence missions into Vietnam. Codenamed the Deer Mission, OSS Detachment 202 agents Paul Helliwell, the future American architect of the French Connection, counterinsurgency expert and future Ho Chi Minh Trail strategist Lucien Conet, and future MACV-SOG leader John Singlaub all parachuted into rural Vietnam to deliver medical care to an ailing Ho Chi Minh, who was suffering of malaria. In retrospect, this may have seemed to go completely against American interests in the region, but the situation in Southeast Asia in 1945 was completely different than the situation in, say, 1953. In 1945, the Chinese Civil War was still undecided, and many American power brokers genuinely believed that the KMT could not lose. During this time, Ho Chi Minh and his nascent Viet Minh resistance movement, which posed the most significant threat to the Japanese, appeared to be nationalist first and foremost and communist second. And finally, Ho Chi Minh, in his rhetoric anyways, presented himself as open to cooperation and even alliance with the United States and the Western powers, if they would support his mission for an independent Vietnam. Initial reports from the OSS team that tended to Ho Chi Minh recommended that Washington offer their backing of his movement. He quoted the American Declaration of Independence and stated that the Vietnamese people had been asking for American support since the times of President Lincoln. This would all change when American agents in liberated Vietnam would discover that not only had Ho Chi Minh spent a substantial period of time in the Soviet Union, but he was also an ardent communist. Interestingly, however, it was not the US who ended up with liberated Indochina. It was actually Chiang Kai-shek's KMT, who sent General Lu Han's army of 200,000 men from the Chinese state of Yunnan down through Indochina to expel the rapidly deteriorating Japanese army. Chiang had no interest in Indochina, as he was still primarily focused on winning the civil war in his own country. But in 1946, the French and the KMT would sign a deal wherein the French would regain their Indo-Chinese colony, and in return, the French would renounce their concessions in China and lose their extraterritorial privileges. A pretty sweet deal for the French, who returned to their colony and picked up where they had left off. Although one thing had changed in Southeast Asia since 1941. The people had seen the open door of independence. And as the French and later the Americans would prove, that door would prove impossible to close, regardless of how many bombs were dropped. In February 1946, as the door for liberation remained open for the Vietnamese, the door for friendship between the US and Vietnam finally shut. Ho Chi Minh cabled President Harry Truman with one final plea of support for their independence. Ho's cable, which is on screen now in its entirety, evoked both the Atlantic Conference Charter and the San Francisco Charter. The San Francisco Charter is otherwise known today as the United Nations Charter. These two proclamations, the Atlantic Conference in 1941 and the UN Charter in 1945, extolled broad support of the colonized world from the West, promising support in self-determination and independence following the end of the global conflict. Ho Chi Minh's telegram was largely ignored by Truman, who was fully focused on the escalating Cold War with the Soviet Union. Supporting a socialist state's independence in Southeast Asia, even against late and untimely French colonialism, was truly untenable. To the White House, it still appeared that the KMT would win in China, which would form a strong bulwark against the rising Viet Minh. Working with Ho was no longer an option. This moment in history is one that I look back on as one of the truly fascinating what-if moments. Let's say Truman had supported Ho Chi Minh and had pressured the French to exit their colonies, as the British were doing at the same time in India. Would the Viet Minh have sided with the Americans? Would they have remained as neutral communist powers in Southeast Asia like Yugoslavia in the growing Cold War? It's hard to say, but I do nonetheless personally consider this a massive foreign policy mistake, given the quagmire Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia would shortly become for the French, and eventually the US. As we will see, the French would not let go of their Southeast Asian colonies despite the irreversible turning tide of Third World Revolution and independence facing them. But that will be for our next chapter, in the first step of the secret war in Laos during the French Indochina War. Thank you all so much for tuning in for this first part of the Secret War in Laos documentary series. The video you watched today first aired to my Patreon subscribers on March 18, 2024. I would not have been able to dedicate the time and effort away from friends and family producing this video or any of the other videos I produced this year without their generous support. As you know, when you watch Eyes Wide Open on YouTube, it is always ad-free. I do not make any money off of YouTube ads, which allows me to say what I want and not worry about keeping my content within the confines of YouTube's stringent monetization policy. That said, I am completely dependent on individual support to do the work that I do. So firstly, thank you very much to my patrons for believing in my work. On screen now are the screen names of my producer tier patrons. Thank you especially for your ongoing support. If you wish to support my independent documentary filmmaking, please consider checking out my Patreon link below. All the videos that will be premiering weekly on this channel over the next couple of months are available there now if you wish to binge them. I have also uploaded the first video of Eyes Wide Open Season 3 on there, which will premiere on this channel at the end of 2025. Subscribing throughout the year gives you a consistent feed of Eyes Wide Open videos as I produce them, so that you don't have to wait till fall of 2025 to receive those videos. So please do consider supporting me there if you are able to. Next week, I will be uploading my documentary on the French Indochina War and Operation X, which was the French's first attempt at a narco counterinsurgency program in Southeast Asia. This operation would inspire such figures as Edward Lansdale, a counterinsurgency expert at the CIA, and the Pentagon. I hope that you will tune in for that as well. That's all I've got for today, though, folks, but thank you as always for watching, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.